Johnson was a hardworking rubber dealer, known in his community for his determination. But his life took an unexpected turn the day he first saw Fancy. She was tall, elegant, and so captivating that he couldn't take his eyes off her. Her graceful walk and confident demeanor made her stand out in the crowd, and Johnson was instantly drawn to her. A few days later, as fate would have it, he saw her again. This time, he mustered the courage to approach her. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice steady but nervous. "Fancy, right?" The young lady turned around, her face lighting up with a smile. But what she said next left Johnson speechless. "Oh, that must be my sister, not me," she replied playfully, her tone warm and teasing. Johnson blinked in surprise, taking a step back. He whispered to himself, "They are twins." "I think so." The resemblance was uncanny, but there was something about Fancy that felt different. From that moment, he was determined to know her better. Fancy was equally intrigued by him. She admired his humility and his respectful approach, qualities she rarely saw in others. Over time, their bond grew stronger. Johnson admired Fancy not just for her beauty but for her intelligence and kindness. Fancy, on the other hand, appreciated Johnson's sincerity and ambition. They became inseparable, and Fancy would often share stories about her family, especially her twin sister. "My sister and I are so alike, but also so different," she once said, laughing. "People confuse us all the time, but she's a little more reserved." Johnson found it fascinating. The twins' close relationship was heartwarming, and their connection reminded him of the importance of family. As Johnson and Fancy's love deepened, they faced small challenges and funny mix-ups because of her twin sister. But little did they know, their love story was about to take unexpected twists that would test their trust, loyalty, and courage in ways they couldn't imagine. Johnson's life was the talk of the town. Despite being a rubber dealer, his extravagant lifestyle turned heads everywhere he went. He drove a brand new Lexus RX, wore designer clothes, and lived in a luxurious house. People whispered behind his back, questioning how a rubber buyer could afford such a life. Fancy, however, never asked questions. She was blinded by the gifts, the trips, and the glamorous parties they attended every weekend. To her, Johnson was the perfect boyfriend, a man who adored her and spoiled her like a queen. She never thought to question where all the money came from. But Johnson harbored a dark secret. Behind his charming smile and lavish lifestyle was a man who had dabbled in rituals. The source of his wealth was not his rubber business but something far more sinister. Johnson had sacrificed many people to maintain his fortune, and though it haunted him at times, he had no plans to stop. What Johnson kept hidden from Fancy was even darker. Deep in his heart, he knew his endgame. Fancy was special to him, but she was also part of his plan. Someday, she too would become a part of his rituals. However, he played his role perfectly, showering her with so much love and attention that she never suspected a thing. One night, Fancy's twin sister, Fanciful, had a dream that left her shaken. In the dream, Fancy went on a journey but never returned. The vision was so vivid, so real, that Fanciful woke up in tears, her heart pounding with fear. She knew she had to warn her sister. The next morning, she called Fancy. "Sister, please, listen to me," Fanciful began, her voice trembling. "I had a dream about you last night. You went somewhere, and you didn't come back. It felt so real, Fancy. Please, be careful." Fancy laughed nervously, brushing off her sister's words. "Oh, Fanciful, it's just a dream. You worry too much." But Fanciful wasn't convinced. "No, Fancy, it's more than that. There's something off about Johnson. His lifestyle doesn't match what he says he does. You need to ask questions. Please, just promise me you'll be careful." Fancy hesitated for a moment. Deep down, she had sometimes wondered about Johnson's wealth, but she always dismissed it, choosing to focus on the love and luxury he provided. Now, with her sister's warning, a seed of doubt was planted. Yet, the allure of Johnson's money was strong, and Fancy was blinded by the life he offered her. She reassured Fanciful that everything was fine, but Fanciful couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking. As the days passed, Fancy's mind wavered between trusting Johnson and listening to her sister's warnings. Little did she know, the clock was ticking, and Johnson's dark plans were drawing closer to becoming reality. Fancy listened to her sister's warnings but dismissed them as nothing more than paranoia. She reassured Fanciful that she was safe and continued her life with Johnson as if nothing had changed. The parties, the expensive gifts, and the constant attention from Johnson blinded her to the dark reality hiding behind his charm. Johnson, on the other hand, felt the weight of time pressing down on him. He knew the final stage of his rituals required someone special, someone he loved and trusted. Fancy was the perfect choice, and he had been preparing for this moment for months. He knew how to keep her distracted and unsuspecting, and now the time had come to act. One sunny afternoon, Johnson approached Fancy with a calm and charming demeanor. "Fancy, my love," he said, holding her hands gently. "I need you to accompany me somewhere tomorrow. It's very important." Fancy looked up at him with curiosity. "Where are we going?" she asked. Johnson smiled, his voice steady and reassuring. "It's a surprise. You'll find out when we get there. Trust me, it's something special." Out of love and loyalty, Fancy agreed without hesitation. The next morning, they set out on the journey together. Johnson drove them to a remote location far away from the bustling town. Fancy noticed the road becoming quieter and more isolated, but she didn't question it. She trusted Johnson completely. When they arrived, the place was eerily quiet. It was a secluded area surrounded by dense trees. Fancy stepped out of the car, looking around in confusion. "Johnson, where are we?" she asked, her voice laced with unease. Johnson's expression darkened. "Don't worry, my love. This is for us," he said, his voice suddenly cold and detached. Before Fancy could react, a group of strange men appeared from the shadows. They surrounded her, chanting words she didn't understand. Fear gripped her heart as she realized something was terribly wrong. "Johnson," she screamed, her voice trembling with terror. "What's going on? Help me." But Johnson stood silently, his face emotionless. He turned away as the men carried out the ritual, using Fancy as the final sacrifice to seal his wealth and power. Hours later, Johnson returned home alone. His clothes were clean, his demeanor calm, as if nothing had happened. He told anyone who asked that Fancy had decided to visit her family for a while. No one suspected the truth. Fanciful, however, felt an unshakable dread. She called Fancy repeatedly, but there was no answer. Deep down, she knew her worst fears had come true. Fancy was gone, and Johnson's secret would soon unravel in ways he never expected. Fanciful tried calling Fancy's phone over and over, but every time, the line wasn't going through. Each failed attempt made her heart sink deeper into despair. She told her mother, who immediately became worried. 3 days passed with no word from Fancy, and panic began to set in. On the 4th day, Fanciful and her mother decided to go to Johnson's house to find out what was going on. Maybe Fancy had gone somewhere with him and forgotten to tell them. When they arrived, Johnson welcomed them with his usual calm demeanor. He looked surprised to see them at his doorstep. "Good afternoon, Mommy," Fanciful, he greeted with a smile. "You are welcome, Mommy," he greeted again. Fancy's mother, her face tight with worry, didn't waste time. "We came to ask about Fancy. We've not seen or heard from her in days. Her phone is not going through, and we're very worried," she said, her voice trembling. Johnson's expression shifted to one of concern. "Fancy. I thought she went to see you," he said, his voice steady but with just the right amount of confusion. Fanciful and her mother exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean she came to see us?" Fanciful asked, her tone sharp. "She hasn't been home, and we thought she was with you." Johnson frowned, shaking his head. "No, I dropped her off somewhere the other day, and she said she had plans to visit family. I haven't heard from her since," he explained, his voice calm but serious. Fanciful's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into her mind. Where did you drop her off? Why didn't you check on her if you haven't heard from her? Johnson sighed, his tone defensive. I thought she was with you. She didn't say anything unusual to me, and I didn't want to disturb her if she was spending time with her family. Fancy's mother was visibly distressed, her hands trembling. Something isn't right, she muttered, her voice barely audible. Johnson, if you hear from her, please let us know immediately. Of course, Mama, Johnson replied, his face composed. I'm just as worried as you are. I'll call you the moment I hear anything. As Fanciful and her mother left Johnson's house, an uneasy silence hung between them. Fanciful couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She didn't trust Johnson's calm demeanor or his vague explanations. We need to find Fancy, Fanciful said firmly, her jaw clenched. Something isn't adding up, Mama. Her mother nodded, tears in her eyes. We'll find her, she said softly, though her voice betrayed her fear. Johnson continued his act of innocence, keeping up appearances with Fancy's family. Days turned into weeks, and the absence of Fancy weighed heavily on her parents. Her mother, deeply troubled, convinced her husband, Okoye, to visit Johnson together. This time, they needed answers. When they arrived at Johnson's house, he welcomed them warmly, as if nothing had happened. Oh, welcome, Daddy and Mommy, he said with a broad smile, gesturing for them to come inside. The couple entered the house and sat down in the living room. Johnson offered them drinks, but Fancy's father declined with a wave of his hand. His face was stern, his patience wearing thin. Breaking the tense silence, Okoye spoke, his voice firm and laced with anger. Where is my daughter? He asked, his eyes locked on Johnson. Johnson's face softened, and he let out a long sigh. Daddy, I honestly don't know. The day we both left the gym, she told me she was going to meet her mother. That was the last time I saw her, he explained, his tone steady and calm. Fancy's mother shook her head, her voice trembling. You mean you haven't seen her since then? Her phone has been off for weeks, and you didn't think to do more to find her. Johnson placed a hand on his chest, as if deeply hurt by the accusation. Mommy, I've been trying her line every day. It's been switched off. I was even planning to come to see you and Fanciful again when you came here the other day. I swear, I don't know where she is. Okoye leaned forward, his voice rising with frustration. You expect me to believe that? You're her boyfriend. How can you not know where she is? Johnson lowered his head, shaking it slowly. Daddy, I understand how you feel. I'm just as worried as you are. Maybe we should go to the police and report her missing. They might be able to help. Fancy's mother, now in tears, whispered, Are you sure you don't know anything, Johnson? Please, tell us the truth. I swear to God, Mommy, Johnson said, his voice unwavering. I don't know where Fancy is. I would never hurt her or let anything happen to her. After asking a few more questions and getting the same answers, Okoye and his wife left Johnson's house, their hearts heavy with despair. Back at home, they clung to hope that Fancy would return. But as the days dragged on, her absence became unbearable, and doubt began to creep into their minds. Something didn't feel right about Johnson's story, but they couldn't yet piece it together. One morning, as the sun peeked through the curtains, Fancy's mother sat at the dining table, her face heavy with worry. She turned to her husband, Okoye, who was sipping his morning tea. We need to take action about our daughter, she said firmly, her voice breaking with emotion. It's been weeks, and we don't even know where she is. I think we should go to the police and report her missing. Maybe they can help us investigate. Okoye set his cup down, nodding solemnly. You're right. We can't just sit here hoping she'll come back. Let's go to the station today. Later that morning, they arrived at the police station, clutching a photograph of Fancy. After filing a missing person report, they handed over the picture to the officers. Fancy's mother begged the officers, her voice trembling, please, help us find our daughter. We'll do anything. The officers assured them that they would start an investigation immediately. They asked questions about Fancy's last known whereabouts, her friends, and, most importantly, her boyfriend, Johnson. The family shared everything they knew, including their visit to Johnson's house. The investigation began in earnest. Officers questioned Johnson, who repeated the same story, that he had last seen Fancy after leaving the gym, and she said she was going to visit her mother. His calm and confident demeanor left the police with little to suspect, but they continued their inquiries. Meanwhile, Fancy's parents took matters into their own hands. They printed posters of Fancy's photo with the words, "Missing, have you seen Fancy?" beneath it. They posted them on walls, utility poles, and shops throughout the neighborhood. Fancy's mother even stood at busy intersections, handing out the flyers to passers-by, pleading for any information. A week passed, and nothing happened. The police had no new leads, and Fancy's phone remained unreachable. The family's hope began to waver, but they refused to give up. 2 weeks later, there was still no sign of Fancy. The posters were starting to fade in the sun, and the family's grief deepened. Fancy's mother couldn't sleep, her mind consumed by questions. Where is she? What happened to her? She whispered to herself each night. Despite the silence, Fancy's family clung to the faint hope that someone, somewhere, had seen her. Little did they know, the truth was closer than they imagined, and it was more horrifying than they could have ever guessed. After 2 agonizing weeks with no sign of Fancy, her parents grew desperate. Sitting in their small living room, Fancy's mother wiped her tears and said to Okoye, "We can't keep waiting. It's time to act. Let's take this matter to the police and demand they arrest Johnson. He knows something, I'm sure of it." Okoye agreed, his face set with determination. The next morning, they returned to the police station and told the officers everything. "That man is hiding something," Okoye said firmly. "You need to bring him in for questioning." The police organized a team, and they headed straight to Johnson's house. When they arrived, Johnson looked surprised but tried to remain calm. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, feigning innocence as the officers approached. "You are under arrest," one officer said. "You need to come with us to the station for questioning regarding Fancy's disappearance." Johnson tried to protest, but the officers didn't budge. "I don't know where Fancy is. You people are pressing me for no reason," he shouted as they handcuffed him and dragged him to the police van. At the station, the interrogation began. The officers questioned him relentlessly, but Johnson stuck to his story. "I swear, I don't know where Fancy went. She told me she was going to see her mother. That's all I know," he cried out. The officers weren't convinced. They decided to intensify their methods, turning to harsher measures. Johnson was tortured, beaten, and questioned for hours, but he still refused to confess. "You people are punishing an innocent man," he screamed. "This is oppression. I didn't do anything." Finally, the officers resorted to using an electric shock device. The pain was unbearable, and Johnson's facade began to crumble. His body shook violently, and his breathing became ragged. He could feel his strength fading, and for the first time, fear of death overwhelmed him. "Please, stop," he cried out, tears streaming down his face. "I'll confess. I'll tell you the truth." The officer stepped back, giving him a moment to gather himself. Johnson's voice trembled as he spoke. I used her," he admitted, his head hanging low. "Used her for what?" one of the officers barked, their anger barely contained. "I used her for rituals," Johnson said, barely above a whisper. His words hung in the air, sending shockwaves through the room. The officer stared at him in disbelief. When the 2 policemen handling Johnson heard his confession, they immediately informed the DPO. The DPO wasted no time. He picked up his phone and called Mr. Okoye. "Hello, sir," the DPO said, his tone grave. "I need you to come to the station right away. Mr. Johnson has made a confession about your daughter." "What?" Mr. Okoye exclaimed, his voice filled with shock and disbelief. His wife, who was in the kitchen preparing dinner, overheard his raised voice. She quickly ran to the living room, wiping her hands on her apron. "My husband, what is it?" I heard you shout. What's going on? She asked, panic creeping into her voice. Mr. Okoye looked at her, his face pale with a mix of emotions. The DPO called. He said Johnson has made a confession about Fancy. I need to go to the station immediately, he explained, grabbing his car keys from the table. Wait, I'm coming with you, his wife said urgently. She hurried inside to change her clothes. Just as Mrs. Okoye was getting ready, Fanciful returned home from work. She stepped into the house, her face tired but cheerful. Good evening, Dad. Good evening, Mom, she greeted, dropping her bag on the couch. Good evening, my dear, her father replied quickly, his tone serious. I and your mother are going to the police station. The DPO just called me. Johnson has made a confession about your sister. What? Fanciful gasped, her eyes wide with shock. Johnson confessed about Fancy. I'm coming with you. All right, but hurry, Mr. Okoye said, pacing the living room impatiently. In a matter of minutes, the three of them were in the car, driving to the police station. The atmosphere was tense, with no one speaking much, their minds racing with fear and questions. What had Johnson said? Was Fancy alive? Fanciful asked, but no one answered her. As they approached the station, Fanciful clenched her fist tightly, silently praying for answers. When they got to the station, they headed straight to the interrogation room with the DPO. The DPO turned to Mr. Johnson and said, "Family, repeat what you confessed earlier." Johnson, visibly shaken, lowered his head and mumbled, "I used her for ritual." As the words left his mouth, Fancy's parents and Fanciful froze in disbelief. The room fell silent for a moment, then was quickly filled with heart-wrenching cries. Fancy's mother broke down, wailing bitterly, "Why? Why my daughter? What did she ever do to you?" Her father clenched his fists, fighting back tears, but his pain was evident. Fanciful, with tears streaming down her face, stepped forward and pointed at Johnson. "I knew it," she cried. "I always felt there was something unclean about you, something you were hiding. You killed my only sister, my twin. How could you? Now, who will I call my sister? Who will share my life with me?" Her voice cracked as she broke into uncontrollable sobs. Mr. and Mrs. Okoye could barely console each other. The weight of losing their daughter was too much to bear, and seeing Fanciful weeping only deepened their grief. Fancy's mother clung to her husband, crying bitterly, while he stood silent, his heart shattered, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have been done differently to save his daughter. The room was filled with sorrow and anger, leaving everyone present deeply affected by the devastating confession. After the heart-wrenching cries had subsided, Mr. Okoye wiped his tears, his face now set with a mix of anger and determination. He turned to the DPO and said, "Family, put him in the cell. I will contact my lawyer immediately." His voice carried the weight of his pain, but also the resolve to ensure justice for his daughter. The following day, Johnson was taken to court to face justice. The courtroom was packed with spectators, all eager to witness the trial of the man whose shocking crimes had shaken the community. Fancy's family sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of anger, pain, and anticipation. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you know you have not subscribed so that you will updated whenever I upload new video, like and please share with your loved ones. See you in the part 2 of this video, stay tuned.